posted a joke a while back. It went like this. I asked God for a bike, but I knew God didn't work that way. So I stole a bike, and I asked forgiveness. It's silly, but it gets at the root of the problem, doesn't it? Forgiveness can make us feel taken advantage of, like there's no accountability, like our grace is cheap or can be abused. One pastor I heard reflect on our passage this morning said that Peter is asking Jesus if he can forgive just a little bit. But the thing is, Peter doesn't ask about partial forgiveness, nor does he ask about how large of a crime he should be willing to forgive. Right before we picked up the narrative today, Jesus had taught his disciples about living in community, saying, if a brother or a sister sins against you, go and point out that fault when the two of you are alone. If the brother or sister listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you have not been listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of their testimony. If the brother or sister refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, I think Peter understood these instructions. I think Peter understood them just as we all do. I want everybody to take your hands, clench them up in fists. Now clench them as tight as you can. Hold them, hold them. All right. Now open them up. Stretch every finger. Feel your muscles open up. Forgiveness is letting go. Letting go of a past that cannot be changed and opening up to a future with hope. It's a natural part of living in community, particularly when you're living in community with people who make mistakes and will keep making mistakes over and over again. It feels good, doesn't it? It's not always easy to let go. The same things that can make us clench our fists, or anger, or pain, or stress. Those same things can make us hold on to grudges, tense up. When we forgive, we release. We release someone else for payback, and we release ourselves from the emotional hold they have on us. It allows us to move forward. As Jesus taught the disciples, forgiveness is not silencing the hurt or injustice or brokenness, nor is it sweeping it under the rug. For reconciliation to happen, there has to be truth-telling, a recognition on both sides about what happened. But forgiveness is that first step. It's that first step that releases the relationship and frees everyone up to move forward. It makes it possible to start the journey towards rebuilding and reconciliation. So yes, I give Peter credit. I think he understood this. What he asks as a follow-up is about something different. Not about partial forgiveness, but about repeated forgiveness. Not about how much he should forgive someone, but how many times. That's a question we all have, isn't it? And it's particularly pertinent when we're going to keep living in community with someone. It's a question that many of us ask in love, not just for ourselves, but for those who hurt us. When does forgiveness move from healing to enabling? When does forgiveness turn us into easy targets? I asked for a bike, but I knew God didn't work that way. So I stole a bike and asked We all know how Jesus answers Peter. Peter asks about forgiving 7 times. Jesus says, no, not 7 times, 70 times, 7 times. But he goes on to tell Peter a parable to qualify this. Now let me ask you a question. How many of you say debts when you say the Lord's Prayer? Debts. A few of us. Yeah. I grew up in a church that always said debts. And then when I was a teenager, we got a new pastor, and he started changing it to sins. Well, I liked that in some ways, because we were talking about hurting others. We were talking about turning our back on God's love and justice. We weren't talking about finances, were we? Well, our passage this week has been making me rethink that. When Peter asked Jesus about repeated forgiveness, he's obviously asking about conflict and hurt relationships, especially given the context of where this question comes. He's not asking about finances. But Jesus chooses to answer with a parable not about sins or trespasses. Instead, he talks about debts. A few years back when I was in seminary, I attended a prayer service at a large mosque. With my head covered, I sat in the corner with some of my classmates, and we watched children play and squirm at their parents' feet. We were listening for what was going to happen in this Muslim service. It was a part of our Islam in America course. We were all sitting on the floor. That was a little different. But a lot was pretty similar. There were songs and there were prayers. There were admonitions to lead a life of justice and service to others. But on this particular day, when the Imam began to give his message, I heard something strikingly different than I had ever heard in the church. He was speaking on the Quran's prohibition against taking on debt. As I sat there and listened, I tried to imagine life in America without taking out loans. I tried to imagine making it through the higher education system without student loans. I tried to imagine making it to buy a car without a car loan. Tried to imagine buying a house without the possibility of a mortgage. How different my own life would look without loans, for the better and for the worse. Loans give us a leg up when we need one, don't they? They sometimes make things possible that otherwise would never be possible. Sometimes they allow us to dig ourselves out of a hole we've made when we've screwed up a bit financially. On the other hand, there is something very wise about that teaching of the Quran, isn't there? Debt, when we allow it to get out of hand, has a way of choking us. It can create this vicious cycle. The interest on the loan can spiral so out of control that it can make it almost impossible to ever pay back the loan. Sometimes we have to take on new debt just to pay off the old. Debt is a huge problem for our country and for many of the individuals in it. This imam that I listened to preached about never owing anyone anything. It was wise advice, really, but it also seemed completely unrealistic to me. I asked my professor later how Muslims survive in America without taking on loans. He explained it's the families, the extended families. They take care of each other. Aunts and uncles and parents and grandparents. They give gifts. They don't expect repayment. They don't sit there with their calculator tabulating everything that they pay for a relative. But it is expected that they will pay it forward. And when they're able, they will do that for other relatives. I remember thinking, they operate in an economy of gifts, not loans. How interesting. Jesus' parable this week had me perplexed. Why tell this story to answer Peter's question about repeated forgiveness? The parable only talks about the king forgiving the servant one time, doesn't it? Now granted, it's an extravagant forgiveness. We don't know much about talents, but it would have taken many years for a servant to earn even one talent, let alone 10,000. In fact, 10,000 is the highest measure in Greek. It's so high that some of the early scribes who were writing down this story decided that they would change it to a lower, more reasonable sum because it sounded so outrageous. Selling this man and his family into slavery, which was a common practice to pay off debt, it probably wouldn't have come even close to covering his debt. No king would ever forgive a debt that large. No king would ever extend that much credit to someone. It's almost as if the servant has found a credit card company that doesn't run credit checks. They just keep extending more and more credit. Certainly the king had to know that it would never be repaid, that it could only be a gift. I think Jesus tells Peter this parable to remind him of the kind of economy he lives in within the kingdom of God. An economy of extravagant and repeated gifts. To remind him that God's gifts and God's forgiveness are given free and freely. But they aren't cheap. There is an expectation that those gifts will be paid for. Catherine Matthews Huey at the UCC national offices wrote this week that we often have a tendency to invert the rule of neighborly love. We want to do unto others as they have done unto us, not as we would have them do unto us. What we are really called to, however, is to do unto others as God has done unto us. That's a tough task, isn't it? So I'm going to ask you, pull out that mental scorecard you have. Even as you look around this sanctuary this morning, you may have a scorecard. You may have been keeping score of wrongs. You may have been keeping score of debts. You might think some people don't contribute enough time or money. Maybe someone has hurt you, said something that made you cringe. I'll ask you again, take those fists, clench them tight like you're crumbling that scorecard. It may take time. Forgiveness isn't always easy. But when you are ready, whether it's right now, or the coming days or weeks or months or years, release. If you have really been abused or your trust has been violated, it doesn't mean that you don't look for refuge and support and accountability from your community. It simply means that you let go. Let go for their sake and for yours. Not because the person that you have a score against deserves it, but because you live as someone who has been freed. Because you live as someone who has been given an abundance. And you can't help but let that overflow. And now I want you to pull out another mental scorecard. This is the one you have against yourself. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is ourselves. I won't make you clench your fists again. But I want you to think about ways that you could release yourself. Ways you could forgive yourself as God has forgiven you. This forgiveness is a way that we live in response to God's gifts. There are many ways that we live lives in response to God's gifts. Over the next 6 Sundays, we're going to start a new worship series called Responding to God's Gifts, and I invite you to join us as we explore them. This week, may God be with us as we learn to let go.